Hey everyone, welcome back to the Royal Palace Podcast. I'm Liam. I'm here with Patrick, and we're coming at you for another, I guess you could call it an election special. Anyway, an emergency episode on the sudden fall of the French government that happened moments before we are speaking here.
That's right. So if our listeners remember from our previous election specials, Macron decided to dissolve the National Assembly back in June of this year. And this led, he did it at the end of May, but the following elections were held in June. The new Popular Front, which is a coalition of left-wing parties, received a plurality of votes, as well as we saw gains in the far right, so the National Rally Party. And then, as we talked about on our latest election episode, Macron ended up appointing Michel Barnier, who is a center-right, or maybe even right-wing figure.
Solidly right-wing. I'd say almost far-right. You say your latest election special, but just want to remind you that we've actually had 2 episodes we've called election specials. Since then, they were just about the U.S. election. We're back to talking about the French election. Probably election special is a bit of a misnomer here, because the last election happened in July, and there's no indication that there's going to be any more French elections anytime soon. In fact, there can't be another National Assembly election until next September, as we'll talk about. But this is, I guess it's still the aftermath of what happened in July, basically. This government could only last, how long has it been since the...
2 months.
2 months?
Yeah. And so, as we mentioned in our previous episode on the subject, this right-wing government could only be formed by the far right, the National Rally, getting on board. And as we said, that was a risky choice for them, because their whole thing is being anti-establishment and very anti-Emmanuel Macron. Now, Macron was willing to make this agreement, presumably because fundamentally he prefers the right over the left at any cost. But Macron himself, even to this day, wouldn't call a far right winger. I think he's a neoliberal par excellence with a little bit of Gaullism, like a thin layer on top.
Not enough.
Yeah,
I think it's generous to call him a Gaullist.
I said a thin layer.
I think a thin layer, and that most French politics still has a thin layer of residual Gaullism on top. We should really do an episode on Gaullism at some point, because we keep saying that, and we've never really explained what that means to the listener. But it'd be great to get someone on who knows more about the legacy of the general. But yeah, let's do a little refresher on how things stand in the National Assembly for our listeners. So we've got Macron, the president, right? And as we've talked about before, at several different points, France has a semi-presidential system, which means they have both a president and then they have a prime minister. And so President Macron, who, as Patrick said, is, a neoliberal, let's call him. His party has only 93 seats out of the 577 that there are in the National Assembly, which is France's lower house, basically France's House of Representatives. So only 93 out of 577. That's why that election in July was such a disaster for him, because he commanded an effective majority with his other right-wing allies previously. And now him and his other right-wing allies, which is principally a party called the Republicans, and a party called Horizons, and the other people whose names I always forget because I feel like they keep changing it, but who are called the Democrats, funnily enough, in their House of their National Assembly group. They together have 210 seats out of the 577 seats, so a minority. And they were able to install Michel Barnier as prime minister, because they had the votes of the far right party, the National Rally, who are the biggest party in the parliament and have 124 seats. However, they got toppled because they lost those votes. So that's another important thing to understand, because this motion de censure, which is what happened, what we'd call a motion of no confidence in English, doesn't exist at all in the US, right? So anyone who's listening who's, I don't know, familiar with the British political system or really any other political system in Europe is familiar with this, but Americans really aren't. But what that means is that, so you need the prime minister is appointed by the president, but then needs a majority of the National Assembly to vote for them in order for them to be able to form a government. But likewise, they need to maintain the support of the majority of the National Assembly in order to keep governing. And at any time, that support can be withdrawn by what's called a motion of censure. A motion of confidence. I keep accidentally saying the French term. But that's how it works in most parliamentary systems, right? And that's why in like the UK or Germany, for example, you don't get elections that are regularly scheduled every 4 years. Well, in theory they are, but often they happen out of the blue. For example, Germany is going to have an election in a few months. I don't think we know exactly when yet. But if a government goes into crisis and they lose the support of a majority of parliament, they're forced to have another election. Things don't work quite like that in France. Because the parliament can't dissolve itself, and the only person who can dissolve the parliament is the president. But the president, after dissolving the parliament, has to wait a year to dissolve the parliament again. So he just did that in July, which means that he can't dissolve the parliament right now.
Yeah, and so what brought us to the motion of censure today, because it's been tried before, the new
motion of no confidence. I'm going to insist on the correct English translation. No Frenchisms here.
That's right. This is not the first time that a motion of or a vote of no confidence has been suggested. The New Popular Front has attempted it before, but previously that was just kind of them saying they wanted to do it, and the right didn't bite. However, we came up on voting the 2025 budget, and unsurprisingly, that's a contentious question, because it's, are we going to raise taxes? Are we not going to raise taxes? Are we going to spend more money on stuff? Are we going to take into account changes in the economy when we think about retirement, et cetera, et cetera. And the getting to a consensus on that requires the democratic process, right? It requires reconciling views from the right and from the left, and getting it to pass in Parliament. But there's also another way to do it, which is the famous 49.3, as they call it. I mean, there's Article 49 of the French Constitution, and 3 refers to the third paragraph of it, which essentially allows the government to push through a law without the normal parliamentary voting process by essentially subjecting it to the risk of a motion of no confidence. So basically what you do is you say, hey, look, we're forcing through this bill, and the only thing you can do to stop us is to vote, is to submit a motion of no confidence. Yeah. And so it's kind of like it's
an ultimatum, you could call it. Like, so what happens is, you could say it's similar to how the U.S. Congress sometimes ties things that it knows are, things that are unpopular get sort of built into these larger bills where everyone kind of feels like they have to vote for it, because it's kind of like you either agree to this thing or you're going to throw away our whole project. And so infamously under the previous, 2 governments ago, but under the governments that Macron had before the election, he used this procedure over and over. So this has happened. There's been, since in the Fifth Republic, there have been 51 motions of no confidence discussed because of Article 49 being invoked, and 28 of those happened under the government of Elizabeth Bourne, who was the prime minister 2 prime ministers ago before Gabriel Attal, which was last year, because France has really been cycling through prime ministers. But so under that government, you had this really unstable formation where Macron, much less unstable than what just fell, but it was already unstable that Macron didn't have a majority and was relying on the center-right party, the Republicans, to support him. And what he found was that he was trying to do all these unpopular things that the Republicans didn't want to vote for. However, by sort of issuing this ultimatum, by sort of passing it as a decree, and then instead of the vote being like, do you want to reform retirements? The vote instead becomes, do you want to topple this government in order to prevent retirements from being reformed? And that worked very well for both Macron and the right, because the right could vote against the unpopular bills, but not vote for toppling the government. So it's a great way for everyone to sort of like wipe their hands of responsibility by saying, look, we're opposed to this, we won't vote for it, but at the same time, they won't vote to overthrow the government.
Now you can imagine a circumstance where this actually may make sense if like what we talked when we talked about the fall of France in our recent series on the subject. You can imagine that maybe the old Popular Front, the original Popular Front, would have liked to have this power at the time to be able to force through the necessary changes that needed to be made in order to prepare for wartime.
Yeah, and you have to remember that all this stuff. I mean, and again, we really should dive into this at some point. All these provisions of the Fifth Republic that give the president so many powers like this stem from an era where Charles de Gaulle was the president and was subsumed in sort of insane conflicts with his own parliament, with his own government. It was in the midst of the Algerian War, and also remember, there was a far-right, the OAS, a far-right terrorist group composed largely of high-level people within his own army who were opposing him and carrying out terrorist attacks on French soil. And so it was sort of in that context where he, created this constitution based on his own personal popularity. This is only the second time in the history of the Fifth Republic that a motion of no confidence has succeeded. And the first time was in 1962 under the presidency of the general himself. And at this point, the general had, I like calling him the general, but yeah, General Charles de Gaulle had had a parliament that was very opposed to him. And not only did they do a motion of no confidence against his prime minister, who was Georges Pompidou, who would later become president, but they were even considering trying him for treason. So that was how hostile his parliament was to him. Well, at the same time, just a month after that, he won this referendum to give himself new powers resoundingly. So he was very popular in France, but had incredible hostility of his legislature and his own army against him, which is not to excuse that he created this insane constitution that gives the president these authoritarian powers. But it does. It makes more sense when you think of the context of the Algerian War and the OAS and all that.
It's good that you highlight the fact that these really are kind of exceptional powers that do allow the president to wield exceptional power, and which is why I found the debates leading up to the motion of no confidence quite amazing. I mean, because you had the center parties, like the Macroniste parties, arguing that the budget was the result of a consensus and it was like the result of a democratic process or whatever. And I'm like, guys, are you missing the fact that you're pushing this through in an exceptional way using Article 49.3? Like it's like they don't see it as a bad. They could have done this through the democratic process. I think the thing is they weren't willing to make the concessions necessary. It would have been hard nonetheless. I mean, because you have the right and left opposed to each other, but they didn't try.
And again, the majority of times this Article 49 has been used have been under Macron, not just under Macron, but under the past 4 years. The majority of times in the 60-plus year history of the Fifth Republic, which is pretty crazy. I mean, it also, if you really delve into the Constitution, and we're in sort of unexplored territory now of the Fifth Republic's Constitution. I was just watching the news and they were talking about this, that there's Article 16, which would allow, under certain circumstances, the president to just pass a budget himself and that's never been done. And all these constitutional lawyers on the news were saying, well, that would be ridiculous. That would be, it's extreme. That would be, but it is in the Constitution. So
and 49.3 was extreme. This is,
and now it's become normalized, right?
This is a constant thing, and we saw this. It's almost honestly like I was thinking while watching all this, like the parallels to what's going on in the U.S. and has been going on in the U.S. are stark, but also the conclusions are very different. Like, I think the conclusion from the fall of this government that we can make is, oh, democracy works more or less. There's a democratic element to all of this. And that, there's a real fight going on here between the left and the right, and it's really the center that is caved tonight. But with that said, the reaction of the center to all this reminds me a lot of the Democrats. Maybe they're a little bit, a little bit more aware than the Democrats, but I mean, just the rhetoric I've been hearing of, like it's all about stability and norms, and it's like, guys, you're the ones, I guess that's one of the differences, that, the Macronists are the ones who are breaking the norms and then kind of talking about how important they are. Whereas the Democrats were never really breaking the norms, I guess.
Okay, let's talk about what actually happened. So you said this is about a budget, but I want to clarify that this particular projet de loi, this particular bill, is a particular kind of budget bill. And that's a loi de financement de la sécurité sociale, which is a law of the financing of Social Security. So this is only one of the types of budget bills. So this kind of thing works. This is, I guess, suppose kind of getting into the weeds, but we are a podcast about the law, so we might as well get into the weeds on this for a bit. This budget stuff works quite a bit differently than the U.S., which is in the U.S., right, the budget that's being considered every year, and these budgets that get rejected, and that leads to a government shutdown, whatever. That is a budget just of what's it called? Non-mandatory spending, discretionary spending. That's the word. Those are budgets of discretionary spending, which doesn't include things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and so on, because those things are mandatory spending because they've already been committed to. They're not voted on every year. France, in my understanding, does not have that. Correct me if I'm wrong. I believe that Parliament can't actually commit money for following years. So in the US, you can pass a law that says we're committing money to this project for 10 years. And that kind of goes into mandatory spending and isn't reconsidered every year. That law could be appealed, but that stuff's committed, and that isn't part of what goes into the budget negotiations every year. And that's a huge part of the U.S. federal budget. In fact, it's the majority. Like the 2023 budget had $3.8 trillion of mandatory spending and only 1.7 of discretionary. In France, that's not the case. These things that would be called mandatory in the U.S. are considered again every year, but they're considered in a different way. So the state has 3 different budgets. One is what's called the budget d'État, which is the budget of the government, the budget of the state, and that's what we'd call discretionary spending in the U.S. And then the biggest one is what we would call mandatory spending in the U.S., and that is the Social Security budget. But in the case of France, they do actually have to vote on that budget every year, and that's the particular budget that was being voted on now, which makes it obviously a very sensitive topic because it's sort of about things that everyone likes. Notably, obviously this is a much bigger thing in France because France, this budget is including healthcare for everyone basically, which isn't the case in the U.S. So it's healthcare, it's retirement benefits. That's another difference is that we have Social Security in the U.S., but the public retirement system in France is much more comprehensive. And unemployment insurance and other things like this. And so those are pretty unpopular things for anyone to cut, even the right.
Yeah, and to note,
except for unemployment insurance, they're fine doing that. But people do get upset about, especially retirements, right? Because old people vote for the right, and that was one of the big disputes here.
Yeah, and one of the things is, this budget can have an impact of what you pay at the doctor's office because even though France has a form of universal healthcare, that doesn't mean free at the point of use. So when you go to a doctor, for example, in France, I believe at least last year, about 17 euros of your visit is
so
covered
a copay,
by the
basically what we'd call a copay in the U.S. Sorry, go on. But
the 17 is actually the part that the Social Security will pay, and then the remaining, I think the total's 25 or 26 is paid by use. Your copay.
You're talking for a basic general checkup.
Yeah, absolutely, right.
Mm-hmm. So that's a copay. Obviously, those copays are much lower. Like you're saying, you'd end up paying what, like €8 if you?
Yeah, something like that. I don't remember because that's the other weird thing about this system is because it's kind of digitalized. at the point of service, especially if you have a complementary insurance, you might not even pay anything.
So we haven't talked about healthcare in depth yet. We obviously will at some point because that's one of those big topics that people are always asking about with France. But yeah, you get something called a carte vitale, life card, I guess you could translate that as.
A vitals card.
A vitals card, and this card sort of has all your healthcare data on it and also your insurance, and everywhere you go, you just give them that, and that sort of sorts everything out for you, basically. No matter what exact insurance setup you've got and so on. We'll get into that more on a future episode for sure. Yeah, so actually this budget was going to raise the amount that you would pay, the co-pays, effectively by 5%, I believe. So, okay, well, basically, we want to back up. We talked about on our last episode about Barnier's government, that Barnier's biggest thing is being a debt hawk. Kind of an old school right-wing thing, because Macron has absolutely not been a debt hawk.
No, he loves spending money.
Right, and no one's really been a debt hawk in Europe for a few years because of COVID, basically. Like, it is true that like the French budget and the US budget and lots of European budgets ballooned during COVID, and the right was for this, basically, because it was a lot of what was happening was they were just shoveling money at private businesses and large corporations and stuff.
In truckloads.
In truckloads. I mean, again, same thing in the US, more so in the US, actually. But yeah, you had a similar thing in France. They were just shoveling money to try to keep the economy afloat. And, that's a whole debate about whether that was a good idea or not. But now what you've got is that France is running a budget deficit, which it always has been, to be clear. And it's also running, I believe it's running less of a budget deficit in the US. And it certainly has a lower debt to GDP ratio than the US, although still one of the highest in Europe. And the European Commission this year has decided that they're going to start getting annoyed about that again. And it really sucks. This is happening everywhere in Europe. It really feels like we're back in 2012, where suddenly everyone's talking about debt and cutting government budgets, which is, oh God, I thought we got over that. I thought we'd all agreed that the fact that every European government did that in 2012 is the reason, or one of the big reasons why Europe has stagnated for the past decade compared to the US, which did a much bigger fiscal stimulus. But apparently not. And so Barnier was all about austerity and cutting government budgets. And the RN is sort of like nominally behind that. The far right is kind of nominally behind that.
So long as it's things that they don't think will affect them. Like, they're totally cool with like cutting off migrants or whatever from any social services, that kind of thing. But, they're not going to let the... I don't know, for example, farmers. They're not going to let farmers lose their subsidies, right?
And the biggest thing they were upset about here had to do with retirement payments, which of course...
Which are cruel, right? Like, I mean, it's horrific.
Yeah.
I used to work with a woman who, she started working before the age of 18. I think she was 15 when she started working. And she retired at like 63. The retirement age in France is 62, or it was 62 until Macron, pushed his 64 this year. But anyway, she retired and she gets $1,200 a month to live in the Paris region, which remarkable.
Rent in the lower than a lot of rents in the Paris region.
Yeah, and she was saying the only reason she's able to survive is because her husband's still working.
Yeah, and so it is true that lowering rents, or what they were effectively, lowering pensions, which they were effectively not lowering pensions, but they weren't readjusting them very favorably to inflation or something like that. This is cruel, but it's also the case that is the only type of payment, like the only type of benefit cut that upsets the right anywhere in Europe. You'll find this all over Europe. And the reason is because, who votes in general these days? It's old people, and especially who votes for the right, and especially the far right, it's old people. So people on pensions is just a massive part of Le Pen's base. And, they're all for, I'm sure they all go out in polls and say, oh yeah, cut the benefits there. The welfare state, blah, 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 to make people get back to work. But as soon as you tell them, they're even okay with raising the age of retirement because they're like already over that. But once you tell them that their money they're getting from the state, their benefits, their welfare set would be cut, suddenly they're socialists. Suddenly they're good Scandinavian style social democrats and want more benefits. So that was definitely one of the big things. There's another major thing, which was so raising raising these healthcare costs, which 5%. It's not. I don't know. Nothing in this budget was crazy, I guess. But it's all sort of just let's make things a bit worse for people. Let's make benefit payments lower, and let's make healthcare costs higher.
And this was the wrong time. That's the thing. It's just it was the wrong time to do this.
Yeah, and the other thing they also managed, it's kind of remarkable, they also managed to upset a lot of centrists and business people because, I don't know if you heard about this part, Patrick, this finally got mostly thrown out by the Senate. But what they wanted to do was raise what do you call those? Cotisation of employers, the what employers pay.
So in France, just like in the US, when you pay for quote unquote entitlement programs through the employer and employee relationship, they're not actually taxes, right? It's not the same thing as your income tax. Instead, it's kind of like a pay per service kind of thing, although it doesn't really totally correspond to the service. But the basic idea is that when you're employed in France, your employer and the employee both pay a portion of retirement, a portion of healthcare costs, and those are called cotisations in French.
Yeah.
And so the cost to employers is pretty high.
It's very high compared to the US.
It's very high
compared to a lot of countries.
And what they wanted in this case, they would have increased it on the side of the employer.
What they specifically were doing is increasing it on. So there's exemptions for people around minimum wage, which is called SMIC in France, and minimum wage up to 1.3 times minimum wage. Those salary bands, a lot of what the employer pays is, they don't have to pay that. They're exempted from paying it for those levels. And this is kind of interesting. I was reading up on this because there's actually good reason to think this isn't such a good idea. And this was a right-wing policy.
Terrible idea, by the way.
This was I mean that there's reasons to think, economic reasons to think that having those deductions is a bad idea.
Oh, it keeps people down.
Exactly.
It prevents wages from rising.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of economists who have been saying that these things, which were all done under right-wing governments, by the way, for the most part, and have been done since the crisis, basically, in order to stimulate job growth. But what they do,
great jobs,
right,
like working at the grocery store.
Right, very productive jobs. But what they effectively, might do is what they call a low wage trap, where it might be less favorable for your employer to raise you above a certain wage because suddenly the payments they have to pay on your wages to the state will shoot up. So actually getting rid of those or changing that system doesn't sound like such a bad idea to me. I mean, also because I don't think...
Yeah, but I think we would both agree that we believe this should just all be rolled into general taxes.
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, that actually upset businesses and the business lobby, and they got a bunch of economists to testify to the Senate that this was going to, destroy job growth in France, which that also might be true in pure numbers, right? But
what job growth?
Yeah, true. So they basically got rid of that, but they kept some of it, and that was another thing the RN was unhappy about. But what everyone seems to think is that this really wasn't about the particular budget. This was more about it was about the RN. I've been watching some TV today, and you kind of had they were interviewing MPs from the RN, MPs from the center, MPs from the right. Of course, not many MPs from the left, but they were all sort of shooting back different accusations towards each other. So they had an RN MP on, and he was saying that the government has not been talking to us. The government has shown no willingness to work with us, and it's because Gabriel Attal, the former prime minister who's now the parliamentary head of Macron's party, is putting pressure on them not to talk to us. So the RN was basically saying that it's the Macronists who are forcing the government not to work with us. At the same time, the government was saying, that Le Pen has been going on TV and making these speeches for the past week saying, here are my red lines. And then the government has incorporated those red lines into the budget, and Le Pen comes back out saying, I have some new red lines. So one side or the other, clearly someone or multiple people wanted this partnership over. It's probably Le Pen, but it actually also seemed possible to me that maybe maybe Macron isn't so happy about this either. Who really didn't want this over is Barnier, and that is pretty clear. He's been pretty desperate. But why do you think Le Pen would choose, after only 2 months after supporting this government, to topple it? Because again, to be clear, what happened is the left. It was toppled by the left, effectively. Like the left, both the left and the RN put forward motions of no confidence because the left has more people than the RN. Theirs is the one that got voted for first, and the RN voted for it. So the fact that the left did this is not surprising because, again, they already did this. Like, they've been doing this constantly over the past few years. They've been constantly trying, putting forth these motions of no confidence that they know won't succeed, but just as sort of a tactic of constantly trying to push back against the government and say the government is illegitimate. And it was really the decision by Le Pen and the far right to vote for it that is decisive here. So why do you think she made that reversal, Patrick?
So I'm in a bit of a gambling mood. I mean, we guessed right the re-election of Donald Trump, so I'm going to just go out and say my thoughts on this. I think the fall of this government was 90% Le Pen and 10% the socialists. Here's why. So I think Le Pen noticed that the Barnier government wasn't looking good I think she's done a lot of work over the last 2 months, and so has the people at the conservative news channels to really sell this idea that somehow this government is, even though it's on their side, ostensibly, that it's just not, it's just not enough. And, honestly, I believe it. I don't think, I think Macron was just relying on this idea that they would go along with it because they hate the left more than they hate Macron. But I think that might have, first of all, I think that calculus might have been not totally accurate. I think it's just more that Macron hates the left more than he hates the right. So he assumes that's the case with Le Pen. But why she did it now? Well, because, we said that the Social Security is something that matters to the French, and we also said in our last episode that this can't go on forever. So did she pick a good time to call in, to call in her card? I think yes. And I think doing it in this first 2 months is actually kind of perfect because the Barnier government kind of got to do nothing. So they didn't get to actually really implement any of the far right wing policies that Le Pen would want, which thank God, but also thank God for Le Pen, because that means she can really run on them and run on this idea that the center isn't actually for the far right, even though they were. But she can really capitalize on that. But the other thing is, I think this shoots Macron, like Macron's parties. I think the center is going to suffer a lot because of this. It's going to be very hard for him to find anybody dumb enough to take the prime ministership. Yeah. I mean, look at what it's done.
There's a lot of idiots in French politics. I mean,
yeah, but we've gone through a lot of them.
That's true. They've burned through a lot of their useful idiots.
Right. And so Barnier was like, I mean, that guy must be so mad about this because I'm sure it took some, I'm not giving him too much credit, but it was hard for them to find anybody. And this is,
and he's a well-known figure. That was a big name. Compared to some of the previous people they've got.
Yeah, compared to Born or Attal.
Or Jean Castex.
But
these are nobody.
This is a losing position to take the prime ministership of France. The only person who would take it is someone like Gabriel Attal, who owes their entire existence to Macron. And even then, do you really want to reach the height of your career for a month in this context? I'm not sure. The other thing is,
it's cool to be able to say you've been prime minister of France.
Yeah, but soon everyone will be able to say it. But the reason I say the 10% of the socialists is, and this is just completely vibes-based guessing, and some hints at it, in reporting in the past few weeks. I think the socialists have probably signaled in some way, or at least some of them have, to Macron that they might be willing to do a government with him.
Some of them have explicitly said this in the press.
And so, that might have explained why Attal was so willing to, and multiple people mentioned this tonight, that they almost were like courting the socialist as the government was falling, and the socialists, look, they've been defeated so frequently. I mean, they're really, that they might be silly enough to accept this deal, and so maybe they had a role in kind of making everyone say, okay, it's not going to be that bad for us if they get elected. And the other thing I say here is that I think Le Pen feels she's in a position where because you said that there's no elections, right? There's no legislative elections until next year, or it's not possible. But there is a slim but nonetheless existent chance that Macron just steps down.
Yeah, and he could do that, and that was being speculated on TV today. I think it's possible. Yeah.
I think it's possible too, especially if the right and the left stay on this anti-Macron bandwagon. And I think Le Pen knows that if there's an election tomorrow, it will be an election between the left and the right. There will be no contending with, I think, a center candidate anymore, especially after what just happened.
Right. Well, yeah. I want to talk about what's going to happen after for a second, but just to circle back like that to what Le Pen wants, I just want to emphasize Le Pen wants to be president. Everyone knows that. That's clearly been her goal in the July election. That's been her goal for years. And she's got her sights set on 2027. And yeah, I mean, it's entirely possible that she's hoping, or she for some reason thinks that this will lead to Macron resigning now. But even if it doesn't, I mean, just creating chaos for the next few years, and this is a nice bit of chaos, is a good way to like fully discredit him. Also, kind of discredit the center right that has glued themselves to him, the Republicans, and people like Edouard Philippe, who's from Horizons, who is the center right guy who's really glued himself to Macron, who would also like to be president. This does a good job of that. This really makes them look like idiots, and not just like idiots, but also like people who are just Macronists in disguise. Even though in 2027, during the election, they will absolutely pretend to be anti-Macron. And yeah, that puts Le Pen in a pretty damn good position to be the, who everyone on the right votes for in 2027, and even if an election doesn't happen earlier. And she's probably hoping that it'll be, I mean, it's not going to be Mélenchon, I assume, but someone like that against her, someone from the far left who has been demonized by the media for years, to the extent where, again, due to the media, you might get actually a majority of French people voting for Le Pen against a real left-wing candidate, just because they've been convinced that the left is just as bad or worse than the far right for so many years. Yeah,
I think she's willing to bet that if the election happened today and it was her versus Mélenchon, effectively, that's like a risk she would take. Even though, I hope and think that Mélenchon would beat her, but I think she's confident enough that it's a risk worth taking.
Yeah, I don't know what happened with that in that matchup. I'd like to think Mélenchon could beat her, and that's obviously a matchup I would like to see. However, it is true that the demonization of the New Popular Front and Mélenchon and his party in particular has just been ramping up continuously, by the media for years. And I think that a lot of Macron's base would end up voting for Le Pen in that scenario, which is what she's banking on, right? So she could end up winning a slim majority just because, and probably all the good centrists out there, like Macron himself, would get up and would not endorse Mélenchon. Probably some of them would endorse Le Pen in that scenario. And others would say, well, we've got two bad options. This is a disaster for France. I can't endorse anyone. And that would lead to Le Pen winning. I hope that wouldn't lead to Le Pen winning, but yeah, it might. But yeah, let's talk about what's going to happen now. So as we alluded to, or as we said, he cannot dissolve the parliament. So the only time this has ever happened under the current constitutional system was in 1962. And what happened then was that, not to get into details, but basically what happened is that the government did not resign. Well, they tendered their resignation to De Gaulle. De Gaulle said no and instead dissolved the parliament, that's something he was allowed to do, just like Macron did that this year. But the Constitution says if you dissolve the parliament, you can't dissolve them again for another year. meaning till next July. And the election would then happen in September, I believe. So we can't have a new, I think under any circumstances, a new parliamentary election before next September. Which means that either Macron resigns, which sure that might happen at some point, but that's not going to happen immediately. He's not that kind of guy. He's not a quitter, let's say. So instead what we're going to have is a new prime minister. And the question everyone's asking right now is not who is that? I mean, obviously that's important too. But more importantly, when will Macron name a new prime minister? Because remember, as we've talked about previously, it took him, I believe, 51 days, I think, something like that, to nominate a prime minister, to nominate Michel Barnier after the July elections, which is crazy. That's completely unprecedented in the history of the Fifth Republic. Completely wild. And so, could he just do that again? Well, the problem is that France does need a budget by the 1st of January, I think. And so that brings us to what the French media is all talking about right now, which is the possibility of, as they say it, un shutdown américain, an American shutdown. This has never happened in France. It's not really clear if it could happen in France.
It can happen in France.
It doesn't work the same way, but it could, because technically it could. But there's various procedures to stop it from happening. So there's emergency provisional budgets. There's ways to extend certain things. And in the worst case scenario, Macron could use Article 16 of the Constitution to just pass one himself.
Yeah, but I think they can also. I mean, I am not an expert on this subject, and I think a lot of people in France aren't, frankly, because we've just kind of relied on the fact that this stuff just magically works through what we have talked about before as the presidential monarchy. But the way it works for collectivities, like for local government, is if they don't manage to pass a budget. I mean, several things can happen, but one of the most typical is that the previous year's budget just extends, essentially. And I believe
that's not automatic. I just read an article about this in Le Monde, but that's not automatic. It can technically happen. There could technically be a shutdown. It's just that it's very unlikely, because they even got this nice little. I'll send you the article. They got a nice little graph. So it is technically possible. There's nothing automatically stopping it from happening, but it's extremely unlikely, because I think what's most likely to happen, if it came to that, if there wasn't a government by January 1st, is that they would just introduce a very neutral provisional budget to extend everything that's currently happening for like a couple months, and that everyone would vote for that, because it would be basically a technical thing.
Right, and one of the things they need to do is allow the government to collect taxes in the next year.
Yeah,
because if they don't renew
technically,
that, then they have no money coming.
Technically, if a shutdown did happen in the American way, it would be way worse than the U.S. because, again, in the U.S. we're just talking about discretionary spending, and so a lot of the essential services of the government are actually funded already. And in France, that's not the case. So it would be kind of funny that happened, but pretty much impossible. Effectively impossible. So what will happen, right? Who is Macron going to nominate as prime minister? Because, again, to remind everyone of this process, it is entirely up to the president to appoint a prime minister. Technically, I know this because I read this in an article a few minutes ago, he could just appoint Barnier again. That's actually something he's allowed to do.
Well, that's what he did with Attal, right? He had Attal be, they say affaire courante, like to deal with daily operations.
We would call that, in a British context, a caretaker government.
Yeah, caretaker.
The government that, in the US, I guess we just call it a lame duck session. It's kind of the same thing. But, like, once someone's lost the election, they stay in power and manage the affairs of the government, become a caretaker government. And in France, that's done if the president asks them to. Again, it's not normal for it to happen, because usually the president would nominate someone very quickly. It's just that this president prefers things not to work like that, prefers to change the constitutional order. So,
well, he just recognizes that norms are just things you say exist, and they exist as long as it's in your interest.
That's true. Yeah. And these norms haven't been around for that long, right? Only since the 50s. It's not like Britain, where you'd be violating 1,000-year-old norms. But anyway, so there's been some names thrown around for who we might nominate. Like, I saw Le Pen said that we thought we could work with Barnier. Turns out we can't work with Barnier. We'd be willing to, vote for someone who we could work for. So that would be crazy if that happened, but they could just do that again. They could just find someone else who's more amenable to the RN and appoint them again and have the exact same people vote for it. Then presumably have Le Pen throw it all away in a couple months again, which would be the funniest outcome and honestly not impossible. Although I imagine it would have to be someone who is like meaningfully different, meaningfully farther right than Barnier, which again, within the Republicans is hard because Barnier really is an extremist figure, I think, within that party. So it's been thrown around that he could create a technocratic government. This is something that has happened a bunch in Italy, for example, because Italy has had this problem continuously for like decades of being unable to form governments because everyone can't agree on anything. And so they've had several things where it's like, okay, we'll appoint a government that's full of people who aren't politicians. That hasn't historically worked out well for them, but it does sort of, it could succeed. It could an investiture, or however you say that in English. It could get appointed. I don't know who that would be. The other thing, as Patrick mentioned before, is you could have the socialists betraying the left, as they do love to do. And in fact, they've suggested they might do it because, we talked about the candidate for the left previously, which is Lucie Castet. This should be a great time for the left to still have a unified candidate to be holding up. And the France Unbowed and Mélenchon and his party aren't still talking about Lucie Castet and saying now he should nominate Lucie Castet. And honestly, they'd have a pretty good argument for that if it weren't for the fact that the socialists seem to have changed their mind on this again. And the socialists, when they released their official statement about the motion of no confidence, didn't mention Lucie Castet at all. And everyone else is pretty mad about this, of course. And we've had some of the more like rebellious and centrist members of the Socialist Party going to the media and saying that they're not at all committed to Castet. I don't think I've seen that the party leadership has made a statement on that. Maybe I missed it. But for example, I saw that Hervé Solignac, who is a socialist member of parliament, when asked about whether Lucie Castet should be nominated as prime minister, he said that Lucie Castet, quote, forms part of the many names that make sense, but among 66 million French people, she is not the only one. So, weird comment.
I like the idea that they have just like a database of every French person, and they're like considering them all.
Yeah, no wonder it took so long to nominate someone if that's what they're doing. They should do that. Just nominate someone random. Why not? And then, of course, you had Dominique Potier, who's a socialist member of parliament who has a history of being rebellious and kind of close to the center. He said that we are willing to enter into a coalition with anyone who, enforces Republican values, whatever. But you've had a bunch of, again, from what I've seen, you still haven't had the leadership of the Socialist Party, which is Olivier Faure and people close to him, suggesting this. But you've had a lot of their more, not even dissident members. I don't even mean people who are like not in the New Popular Front coalition, but just people who are in the New Popular Front coalition, but are more willing to work with the center, have absolutely been suggesting that they would do that. That would still be, as we talked about before, difficult to piece together because the socialist group has 66 people, and I do believe that there are some people in there. Like, I do kind of trust Olivier Faure. I kind of don't believe that he and the people around him would actually cave.
I remember though, I swear to God, I saw a video of him like from a week ago or something where he was like saying we shouldn't be censoring the government right now. Yeah,
I don't know if I saw that. I didn't see that, but it could be the whole Socialist Party. If the whole Socialist Party abandoned the coalition, that would be the end of the New Popular Front, of course. I think it's more likely that we get a large minority of their MPs who are explicitly want to vote for a Macronist candidate. However, it's still really hard to make the numbers work without the National Front, because the National Front is the biggest party in Parliament, and the second biggest party in Parliament, well, is Macron's, but the third biggest is the France Unbowed. So without either of those parties, it's quite hard to make the numbers work. And you're gonna have to put together a coalition of like just an incredibly broad coalition. And I don't even understand what that coalition would stand for, because maybe a few years ago you could have had a broad coalition like that was anti-far right. But that doesn't make sense now, because we've just established, like literally just established, that the normal right, the Republicans and Macron, are extremely happy to work with the far right. So like it would be incoherent for them to be like, oh, we need to have a Republican front against the far rights, right? So I can't picture how that would work numbers wise. But the other option is, what like how would a left wing candidate work numbers wise, right? Like the left would have to convince, like even the like how many people does the left together have? The New Popular Front.
What, they have 38%?
The Wikipedia page I'm looking at just breaks it down by party, so I'd have to add them all together. But I'm not sure if like Macron plus the New Popular Front would have a majority.
But what would the interest be in that?
Right, well, I guess what you would, theoretically get is Macron finally says, okay, fine, I'll nominate Lucie Castet or someone from the left, and then they have to negotiate that some of the centrists vote for that, which is hard to see why they would, except that maybe there's no other possibility, right? Like, it's almost hard to make any math work here. And so, in a normal parliamentary system, like if this happened here in Spain, it would be, okay, we're definitely going to new elections. Because if you can't form a government, then you get new elections. But in France, that just doesn't happen. That can't happen. So, I don't know. Hard to imagine what would happen.
But there's the parliament doesn't actually have to vote confidence to get the government in initially, do they? Because I don't think.
Yeah, so. Not technically. No, you're right.
Yeah. So that's. I think the only scenario, and I think this is very unlikely, but I think the only scenario that is coherent with everybody is for Macron to appoint, like in the hypothetical of a left-wing government, is to appoint a left-wing candidate and have it be a hostile government.
Right.
Now, the question is, if you're the New Popular Front, do you want to be in a hostile government? Maybe not, maybe. I mean, I could honestly see, and this is the difficulty, if they appointed a strong prime minister from the left who, can be convincing, I think you could have a semi-successful hostile government. I mean, you could probably get the right to support you on certain things. You could probably get the Macronie to support you on certain things. People are willing to play just a little bit good faith enough, but I'm a little bit skeptical of that anyway.
Right, but more the question is, would they face an immediate? Because you're right, and I think we kind of misstated that before. That there is no motion of an investiture technically. What happens is that if you appoint a prime minister the majority doesn't like, they can just immediately have a motion of no confidence.
But I think that's one of the reasons that the Barnier government had the chance of surviving 2 months, is that...
sure, but Le Pen explicitly agreed to that, right? Like, you kind of have to have that. Like if Macron just appoints someone else like Barnier now, without talking to Le Pen, why wouldn't they just vote it down again, right?
But that would be because it's going, it's going back. Well, yeah, I think.
Sure, but same with the left. Like if he appointed someone from the left, why wouldn't it just have a motion of censure immediately? Like, okay, you would have to have. So it is possible. I just checked the numbers. If all of Macron's party abstains from any motion of censure, then that would support a left-wing government. But do they have that party discipline? Because, right, if there was a left-wing government appointed, someone would immediately file a motion of no confidence. The far right or whoever. and you would need. Let me see. So a majority is 589 deputies, I believe, and the New Popular Front has 193, and Macron's party has 93.
You meant to say 289, right?
Did I say one? Yeah, 289. So that actually brings you'd be a few seats off. But okay, presumably you could find a couple people who are not part of Macron's party to vote for it. But that means that you would need, when the inevitable motion of no confidence is filed, you would need no one from Macron's party to vote for it. No one. And also for at least like plus or minus 10 other deputies to not vote for it as well, who are from some other party, like one of the other centrist parties, like Modem or something. And that just is like, maybe. But, again, does Macron even want that?
What about, well, I don't, we're really getting into speculative territory here, but, for Le Pen, for example, there's two ways to play it. She can, yes, immediately do a censor or vote of no confidence and hope that, that will continue to put pressure on Macron for new elections, like for presidential election, which would probably be what the New Popular Front and the National Rally would like and benefit from. But you could also say, well, they're not going to get any laws passed as government. Yes, they'll have regulatory power, but, what are they going to do with it? Maybe we can combine that with also, constant political messaging of, look what the left did. They did nothing as well. Let's leave them in power for a few months. And then you have, you've tried Macronie, it didn't work. You've tried the left, it didn't work. Now time to vote for me. Or she might, I don't think, luckily in France, the left has a moral compass, so I'm not sure they would go this far. But there could be like a non-negotiated temporary deal between them. Like I say non-negotiated in the sense that I don't see Mélenchon calling Le Pen, right? But you could see a thing where it's like, all right, let's get a left government in there to deal with retirement, maybe some minimum wage stuff.
I think you're overestimating how much in common the RN actually has, because in their rhetoric it sometimes seemed like they have things in common with the left, but actually many people in the RN have been going on and on about how they want austerity. They don't like it's.
No, I agree.
They want the Social Security budget to be cut. They want I think that's impossible. But speaking of the budget, though, I wanted to. This is sort of a bit of a moving away from the election, but it's just something I think is relevant because I was looking at the budget to sort of understand what was going on here, and it's interesting how the French budget is raised. Like it is true that France has a big budget deficit, and that probably has to be dealt with, right?
Yeah,
it kind of does because
it's not like the Americans.
It's not like the American case. The Americans can keep there is no problem, as far as I understand it, with the current budget deficit in the U.S. Whatever Republicans say, the U.S. debt, just because of the U.S.'s position as holding the world's reserve currency, this poses no issue to the U.S. to have this kind of deficit. In France, there is an issue. I mean, on the one hand, there's the European rules issue. I don't put too much stock in that because I think France is a powerful enough and big enough country to sort of say screw you to the European Commission, and the rules have to adapt if you say that, which is sort of what, by the way, what Mélenchon's platform is about the EU. Is just say, look, we're the second biggest economy in Europe. We're essential to the functioning of the European Union. We're a big part of the EU's budget. You have to listen to you. Like, we're not a small country like Greece that you can push around.
Look how much Hungary gets. Look at how much Hungary gets away with. Imagine what France could get away with.
Right. I mean, you're going to get away with less with a left-wing platform than trying to do far-right things like Hungary, but it's still like, yeah, absolutely. France is so powerful that what the hell is the EU going to do? But anyway, that is a bit of an issue that has to be resolved at some point. But the bigger issue is just that France doesn't have its own currency anymore. And when you don't have your own currency, running a budget deficit forever is not fully sustainable. It creates issues. I think it's something that definitely has to be dealt, and with at some point, and France is running a big budget deficit. And frankly, I don't think it should be like a left-wing talking point to always say, oh, huge amounts of public debt and budget deficits, that's just fine. It's like, no, in theory, why should France be running a huge budget deficit? It's just that I think that extra money should be raised from more income to the government, aka higher taxes, and not from cutting essential services.
And this is an issue we should get into at some point, like in a lot more detail. But I think a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about the tax burden in France.
Yes. Well, here's what I was going to bring up. So you want to guess for me? Do you know? So this is just, to be clear, this is just the budget d'etat. So this is just like the state budget, so not including Social Security. What percentage of that budget comes from VAT?
40%?
No, it's not that high. It's 29%. But still, that's huge. That's
right.
More than comes from income tax. 27% comes in from income tax, 29% from VAT. For Americans who aren't familiar with what VAT is, you can basically think of it as sales tax. It's technically it's not the same thing, but
it's sales tax that's only paid by the end consumer.
Yeah, but for most people are just end consumer in the U.S. Most people know sales tax is what they pay when they buy a thing.
Sure.
It is accounted. It works differently from a business perspective, and the way it's collected. But from a consumer, it's the tax you're paying. And when you're buying things in Europe, you might have, if you've been to Europe, you'll have noticed that when you buy something, you don't see the tax. Like if you buy a bottle of water, it says €1, you pay €1. You don't pay €1 times, 6.5% or whatever, like in the US, and then you're actually paying a bit more because the tax is built into the price. That's required by law, right? They have to advertise to you the actual price you're paying, which, by the way, makes a ton of sense. The way we do it in the US is stupid. But these taxes are extremely high in Europe. I mean, it depends on the goods, depends on the country, but they're like, many things are like taxed at 25% or higher. It's crazy. And the fact that this raises more of the state's, again, general budget, not including Social Security and so on, then income tax is insane because VAT, like sales tax, is completely regressive. Income tax is the most progressive tax in France, not in some Eastern European countries where they have a flat tax, but in France. And VAT is so regressive. And it's absolutely crazy that this is the way that the state is funding itself. And so the state does have a budget problem. I think absolutely the state has a budget problem. It's just not at all what the right says it is. It's two things. One, they're not raising enough tax revenue to cover your spending. Like, here's what's happened. Spending has gone up in France. State spending as a percent of GDP has actually risen in France over the past few decades. It's at some of the highest it's ever been, which is pretty crazy because you have the impression that that's not the case, but it is. But what's happened simultaneously is that tax rates have gone way down since like the 70s. So how is it that spending has risen and tax rates have gone way down? Well, it's been by tax rates, I mean income tax rates. One, it's been funded by debt, and two, it's been funded by the most insane regressive tax at all, which is a sales tax. And that's crazy, and that's a huge problem. And I feel like no one's really talking about that.
No, I mean, so, in the U.S., supposedly the land of low taxes, up until very recently, the U.S. had a 35% corporate tax rate, and that was 10% above what France has historically been. And France has many ways you can pay a lot less than that. And just around the world, corporate tax rates have been on a race to the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody talks about that, right? Everyone in France is talking about how there's more and more taxes. It's like, no, that's completely perception. It's just not true. And in terms of income tax, like, first of all, like, most people don't pay income tax in France. Like, I need some qualifications there, but yeah, it's not a big part of the tax people pay. What people do pay a lot of is cotizations, right? These are the fees essentially you pay for being part of Social Security, retirement, etc. And those people feel hard. And that is, I think, a big reason that people feel like there's a lot of taxes, because you get your pay slip and, say you make €3,000 a month, you will find that your pay slip is 900 or 1,000, depending on which sector and whatever you work in. It could be up to 1,200 of that is cotizations, and that doesn't include the employer side of cotizations.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I think a lot of French people feel that they have a high tax imposition. Now, if this was not cotizations, instead funded by income tax, most people would actually feel taxes a lot less because the rich would be paying a lot more. And that's the thing about cotizations is, yes, there are some people who have kind of like lower cotizations. It's not everyone pays the same, but it's a lot more regressive than an income tax would be.
Yeah, I didn't even bring up cotizations, but you're absolutely right. It's sort of the same deal as VAT. And why have we seen these things go up? Well, income tax goes down because when you need to raise money, it's kind of a hidden tax. Like, it doesn't show up in people's end of the year tax bill, and also, and obviously most importantly, it doesn't piss off the wrong people, meaning the wealthy. Like, we talked a little bit about, or we mentioned on our episode that's going to be coming out next week about Bernard Arnault, the richest man in the world, and how he fled France and tried to get Belgian citizenship, which they, by the way, rejected during the presidency of François Hollande, who threatened to put this huge tax on millionaires, on incomes over $1 million, which €1 million, sorry. And we should talk more about that at some point, because that was like a crazy outcry, and it didn't go through, and there were several reasons. Part of it was the socialists probably didn't really want to, but also, like, there was just such an enormous pushback for something that would only affect people with more than €1 million of income a year, which is not very many people. Like most people who are millionaires have nowhere near that level of income a year. Right. So whereas raising VAT, that happens all the time. Raising cotizations, that happens all the time.
And deleting other taxes happens all the time. Right. People won't know this, but we talked in a upcoming episode we do on the French media. We talk about how there used to be this tax that would fund the public media sources, and Macron got rid of that. He got rid of the so-called habitation tax. He has changed the way local business taxes operate, and he did the flat tax on dividends, which basically makes for certain people a lot more advantageous to take their money out in dividends. Instead of paying the already lower or was lower than the U.S. corporate tax rate on profits, it adds to it, right? And what's the other thing? And also the reform on the wealth tax, right? Macron lowered wealth taxes, so you've deleted taxes across the board. You've increased spending, and we're told that we need to do something about retirement.
Right. Then the right comes in and says, "Oh my God, we had a huge budget deficit." Well, the answer isn't, "Oh, maybe we should restore all these taxes we've cut," and the answer is, "No, we've got to cut essential services because we can't afford it anymore." That's what they always say, right? Which is ridiculous. Yeah. France is much richer than it was back in the 80s when it had, some of these better benefits, like the lower retirement age at 60, for example. How could it possibly be the case that France can't afford that anymore when it's so much richer than it was in the 80s?
Yeah, as France is spending more and more, why are public services getting worse and worse? It just doesn't make sense.
It's absurd.
And now, I think it was some right-winger who said this right before the vote of no confidence. So, obviously I think this is self-serving on their part and, dishonest, but they were saying, where is the money gone? And I think that's a fair question for people to ask, which is, how are they losing a third of their salary to cotizations? Like, it just doesn't seem to make sense when they're being told that the retirement age is going up.
Right. And the answer is basically the money has gone to tax cuts for richer people. Like, that's basically the answer. Also spending on welfare programs for businesses, by which I mean like the COVID stuff, just forking out money to businesses, which I know, okay, this is a whole other subject and we should wrap up the episode in a couple minutes, but I feel like that is sort of unquestioned because the left is so Keynesian these days, and so that sort of stimulus spending is good. I do agree that was better than the alternative that was likely, which is them not doing that and the economy just collapsing. However, it's like, it still seems insane to me that both European and American governments just gave away so much money to all sorts of people. And they were giving it away to podcasts. Podcasts were getting that money in the U.S. It's too bad we didn't exist at the time. We didn't exist, I think we would have if we hopefully there'll be another pandemic and they'll give us some money. But that was extremely expensive. And just because it made sense to do from an economic perspective doesn't mean that ordinary people should now be paying the cost of that through cuts to their essential services and the raising of their retirement age. I mean,
right. Having left the pandemic with an economy that's in supposedly a relatively good state because all the money you spent should mean that there's more income to fund these things, to pay back the debt.
But somehow it doesn't mean that.
And as you said, we'll get into this on another episode, but it's also worth pointing out that when you get that very economist argument as to why we had to spend during COVID, I think at the very least it's implied that there was no other economic measures that could have been taken, right? Like it's not like these economists were willing to consider other options in terms of how to distribute the money.
I think some friends of ours, if they're listening, might be upset by. Some friends of ours who are economists or study economics might be upset by that, but I will stand by it. And yeah, like for example, if you're going to bail out an airline and they're going to go under if you don't, but you give them billions of euros in order to make it so that they don't go under and they don't lay off all their staff. Just buy the airline, right?
Yes.
Just take it over and make it a
state-run airline.
They're losing
anyway, right? You can buy it for pennies on the dollar, right? And use the gain, the eventual gain, because you know that you'll be able to survive the pandemic because you're the government. Use the gain to finance everything.
And then look, if you oppose the government running an airline, you can privatize it later, right? But don't just give them all these companies got given like loans that were then forgiven. No, just buy them. I mean, like what famously the Icelandic government did with their banks when they bailed out their banks. Unlike the U.S., where for the most part the U.S. just gave loans that were then forgiven to our banks, just give free money. The Icelandic government bailed out their banks because they decided, okay, if we don't bail out the banks, it's going to crash our economy, and we don't want that, so we'll bail out the banks, but we'll bail out the banks by buying them, nationalizing them. And then, if you want to, again, I think the Icelandic government did later privatize most of them, but at least the government's getting some assets. At least the government makes money out of that deal, right? And by the government, I mean the public, right? We.
Right, and I think we've talked about this on another episode. If not, we'll definitely be talking it on a future one. Electricity of France, EDF, used to be a completely state-owned company, and it's responsible for making most of France's electricity. It's in control of its pretty much entire nuclear installations. It's a great company. It does, it powers France, and they decided to renationalize it, meaning the state bought back its stock during the Ukraine war, and that was because they wanted to, they saw it as now once again strategic to own the major electrical company. I have an idea. Why didn't they just do it right when the crash hit and EDF wasn't doing well? Why did they have to wait till EDF was making a relatively good sum of money off of selling electricity when prices went crazy during the Ukraine war?
And the answer is simple, because they don't want to hurt the shareholders. In fact, they want to help the shareholders. That's their main concern.
At least that's what we surmise from the information we're given.
Sure, not to slander anyone in particular. But should we wrap it up there? I think we've said all we could possibly say about what just happened and more. All I can say is bye-bye, Michel. Bye-bye.
I just wanted to say one thing actually before we close this out. I think in the international press, we'll see. I don't know. I think that we'll see diverging narratives about what happened here. But I just want to say my take is that this is a democratic step for France, and this, if it does come down to an eventual quote unquote far left, although I think we can debate whether or not the New Popular Front is quote unquote far left, like if that actually makes sense in a political science sense, and the far right, that's not the same thing as it coming down to Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. These are competing visions for France, and it's profoundly democratic that the Barnier government fell. And so while we might have some instability in the coming months, it's only because there is still a drop of democracy that bleeds through.
I completely agree. I was seeing on French TV earlier today, everyone talking about how this was about chaos and the far right wants chaos, Mélenchon wants chaos, Le Pen wants chaos, whatever. It's like this is the worst possible narrative. Like a government collapsing like this is part of how democracies, real democracies, looking at the US there, function. The fact that there is not possible for this to happen. It's possible for, let's say, in the US for Biden to go years with like a 30-something% approval rating with the majority of the country against him. And there's no possible way for him to stop being president. Like there's nothing you can do short of an impeachment is crazy. Whereas in European democracies, and France is like actually one of the least democratic representatives of it using this metric, but in most countries it should be, no, if your government screws up really badly, you can just get thrown out and then people get to decide again. And that's a good thing. That's not chaos. And if, as I've always said, when people like talk about how, Belgium has a chaotic political system or Italy has a chaotic political system, it's like, no, if they can't form governments, there's a fundamental problem within the country that in like the political society that needs to be resolved, and just sort of putting a government in place that most people don't want is not a lasting solution to that. But yeah, should we call it there?
Vive la République, vive la France.
Bye, Michel. Bye.
Bye, guys. Thanks for listening.
La France est une chose, à mes yeux, très considérable. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Je veux dire par là qu'à mon sens, elle est quelque chose de très grand. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il y a même là quelque chose d'extraordinaire. Je me fais en effet de la France une certaine idée. Il faut que la France joue son rôle, c'est exact. Et pour qu'elle joue son rôle, il faut qu'elle soit la France.